I got to apologize. I just realized I didn't hit the go live button. I hit the starting screen and everything. I went through an intro, all of that. Darren and I were just talking for like 5 minutes, and I looked up and I'm like, where's the timer? Sorry to make you wait. We'll kick this off a little bit quicker and get us into the conversation. So, thanks for joining. I'm 14 days into this daily challenge of doing a live stream. Clearly, I have not learned everything about this yet, but we're going to get started. Today is a buyer hotline. So, Darren is joining me. We're talking through some very specific like CPG topics, but we want to leave it open for you to ask questions. So, throw it into the chat if you have any comments, questions, or topics you want to cover. And, really, I'm excited to have Darren on here. Was really his like breadth of experience in a lot of different areas. He's been huge in the community for the emerging brands. He's always been supportive of the outside communities like Startup CPG and CPGX and all these other different places that are like really pouring into the smaller brands that are really up and coming. So I really just am excited to talk to him. I'll catch you up. We were just talking about Disneyland of all things, but we'll kind of fast forward and just get into conversation. If you're here live, throw some topics into the chat if you have anything, and we'll just pick it up from here and get going in the conversation. But I'll keep an eye out for any kind of questions or topics that you want us to cover. And Darren, why don't you just kick us off a little bit? You started talking about your history a little bit, and you were on the East Coast and then moved to the West Coast to Jimbo's. But like, what does your CPG experience look like?
So it's actually pretty varied. I mean, this would be my 29th year in retail. I know I don't look like I'm, 29, which is, good, but so it's been 29 years, and I actually started in a small health food store in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. So it's traditional, like the mom and pop supplements, health and beauty, a little bit of grocery. I kind of walked in there 29 years ago looking for acidophilus. The owner was like, oh, why don't you just, you're here so often, why don't you just work? I was going to college at that point. So I thought, okay, I'm going to like pivot. I thought I was going to do marketing and advertising because I'm very like on the creative side. And then, life, how life just hits you and, sends you down a different path. Yep. So I worked for that. And so I've worked on both the East and West Coast. I've been a category manager, director of purchasing. Basically, if you think about it, it's all center store categories, all dry goods. I've done every category within grocery. I would say within that period, most of my real experience has been through supplements, health and beauty. It's been my passion, how I kind of got into the industry. And then when I became a director of purchasing, then got more into grocery, and I was even an alcohol and beer buyer. So I've been, like I said, every center. The only categories I have never kind of managed or really been part of, I was a general manager at some point, but not necessarily a category manager. Was fresh and produce. And those are things that I do love on a personal level, but it's just never really my path never went into those. Yeah, it's just not. And I really love food. Ironically, like that's, even though my passion's always been supplements and health and beauty, food is really where my heart has been. And a lot of that came from that I guess the different experience I had with supplements and health and beauty is I found with like brands, it was a lot of like these emerging small mom and pop, like, startups. Yeah. And it was always like it's like when you bootstrap and you're kind of all trying to figure it out at the same time, it creates this community of people like just struggling, trying to figure out, like not really knowing what they do, but they have a really heart and passion for something and a mission. So that's really what drew me to more of, I guess, technically the grocery side, if you kind of look at that, where food was definitely a little bit more of a connector than supplements. Supplements would help you obviously with your health, but food really bonded people. And so for me, I looked at that bond, and that's really what I've done. So yeah, I've worked at every size of retailer, obviously Bristol Farms being a larger chain, Jimbo's being more natural focused. We were very, our quality standards were, I would say in this industry, probably the most difficult, or not, I would say, I only say difficult, the more strict, I guess, is the way, but I really learned a lot because it really looked at, when I started evaluating products, you're not thinking about citric acid, but when we had standards of like, oh, here's citric acid, it's coming from vitamin C, and where's that vitamin, it was a different level than I had in my past. Yeah, you had to go deeper because realistically, you're looking at every ingredient and every sourcing, and it just really kind of guided me a little differently than previously when I was working at other retailers. We were more focused on, products that were good for you, but also really what our customers were demanding. And at
Yeah.
Jimbo's, we were a little bit more of a shift, is we were trying to build brands and trying to build categories within our community. So not only were we trying to find products that would fulfill the needs of our customer, but also we wanted to build categories. We were one of the first retailers that, we went our plastic free in our water aisle. We were plastic free in a lot of categories. So we were really, and Jimbo was one of those first people who really was really a big advocate of the Project Non-GMO. So it was cool to be part of that process. And then when I went to Bristol, obviously it was a little different, that we were a little more focused on gourmet, but really leaned in on natural. So that's kind of my experience. And even kind of one of the really shortly, as I actually was at some point, I was an event coordinator and a marketing director within that time frame. And that was really cool, because back in the day when you would have retailers, it was a little bit more natural, was a little bit more destination. And then prior to that process, I kind of developed programs that would bring people to the stores. And a lot of that was through event focus. And there'd be different themes. And so I would say of all the things I've ever done, that was my favorite thing I've done, because I love building community. So having that access to our customers and realize like our events would be 3 hours long. And to realize that this is back in the day where people would spend 3 hours in a store, in a grocery store on a Saturday, and we got to the point, like our events were became so known that our parking lots would be packed with people. We had to do security guard. We made it an event.
Wow.
Like people would line up to get into our store just for these events. And, maybe I don't know if that would be the same today, obviously, because it's a little bit different environment. But that's really how we grew ourselves. And this was in Charlotte at that point. And again, we were a smaller retailer that really was more community focused. We had a community room, we had events, we had lectures, like more of a traditional type of natural food store.
Yeah, dude, that's cool. Yeah, that's a wide array of experience. Meanwhile, I'm just sitting over here stacking cans and rotating yogurt.
I've done that. Trust me, I've had all those experiences, but I've lucked out in that. Really, that I've been a category manager for those 29 years. Like I kind of fell into that role, and then I just excelled in each category that I kind of was given. And I was always one of these people. Like I always say, one of the most difficult categories is beer and wine, because I didn't drink beer and I didn't drink wine. So I was given the category. And and it was funny because I'd be sitting in the room or sitting in the with brands, and they'd I'd have to taste test obviously the wines, and they're like, can you taste and smell? And I'm like, I don't know, it looks like red wine, it looks like white wine. I don't. That was how basic I was.
That would be killer, but actually for me. Yeah,
it was. But I just have always learned in how to grow a category is, working with the brands and really creating a relationship with the brands. Really, you can be successful even in a category you don't necessarily know yourself, because category management is not necessarily about you. You can have an emotional tie to a brand, you can have an emotional tie to a packaging, but in the end of the day, it's really about what the customer's needs are, what the people, it's like any relationship. What are the needs, and how are you going to fulfill that and serve your customer, or really understand the problems of your customers? How I looked at it. So even within wine, is the push point organic, or is it sulfate free? Those type of things. So I was able to adapt pretty quickly in each category for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting. I joke about not being able to do beer and wine as well. And I've never been on the fresh side with produce or deli, bakery, things like that. And certainly there is a lot of nuance to some of those departments, like deli, when you're preparing food and things. But there are a lot of principles that just carry forward in any category. So, like you said, with the wine, you're just looking for different types of attributes and trends and things like that. It's very similar. It'd be the same as how you would approach nutrition bars as a different category. You're going to have different attributes and macros or things that you are looking for that meet the customer where they're at. So, man, I mean, I'm kind of blown away by all of the experience. And I saw you post something about this on LinkedIn a while ago when you were talking about, looking for your next role and your experience. And I didn't realize that you did so much around the store, because, I've always known you as the wellness category manager at Bristol Farms. And, even though we were under the same parent company for a while, I never talked to you. So
Yeah.
like maybe a little bit here on LinkedIn with like, comments and things like that, but never really had a relationship with you. And being under the same parent company, I just thought that was pretty funny. But, I had one thing come up in my mind that I was thinking about, which I'd love to get your take on this with the meetings that you hold with brands. Is there, between all of the departments like grocery, wellness, beer and wine, is there any major difference in how you actually operate the meeting, or in how a brand can come to you, and like what does that wellness meeting look like versus a grocery? Like, I have assumptions, that the ingredients are going to be a lot stronger conversation, the efficacy for wellness versus like promotions for grocery. But I'm just curious what would stand out to you as being a little bit different between the two categories.
I mean, the outline or the meeting's similar because obviously, like you said, you're going to look at the ingredients, you're going to look at the attributes, you're going to look at the promotions. But I'd say what the difference with like a natural living or wellness category is, I also like, you can put it on the shelf, but it's a higher price point. There's obviously a little bit more competitive space. I had to make sure that the brand was going to be able to support the in-store team, because I always felt like, as a category buyer, I can make every decision. I can love the brand, I can love the owner, but especially in like a supplements or a health and beauty category, I need to make sure the team were also part of that conversation, because ultimately they're the ones that are going to hand sell it. So it's really the hand selling difference that I would say with a bag of chips. Like a bag of chips, people
Sure.
are looking at price point, they're looking at promotions, they're looking at the packaging, but in a supplement, and you have like a product like magnesium, and you have 3
Right.
shelves of magnesium. Why does someone choose magnesium? It's either going to be like, they already know the brand. They might have a little bit more marketing behind them. But a lot of it is that I'm looking at like what support once you get on the shelf, what support are they going to offer for the next 3, 6, 12 months? So it's just a different perspective, because I need to make sure there are boots on the ground. Because, I always say
Right.
it was easy to get on the shelf. It was more difficult to get off the shelf. So I had to
Sure.
make sure, what
Yeah.
does that look like to get off the shelf? And, are they going to be able to supply the trainings? Are they going to get the teams? Because I would say the biggest difference with grocery compared to like a natural living is the emotional level. I would say like in a natural living, they're more emotionally tied to a product. As like if within grocery, you're stocking chips.
Yeah.
I would say 9 out of 10 people within the grocery category aren't that tied to a brand. They're just tied to, I got to put this on the shelf. I got to make sure it's stacked out, packed out. They're not emotionally tied to chips A,
Right.
but when it comes to magnesium and there's 2 shelves, they're going to be connected to, they're often connected to the rep themselves. There's an emotional tie because
That's
they
the
see,
relationship
yeah,
that
it's the
they hold
relationship.
in their mind. Yeah.
Correct. And they're more
Like,
emotional behind the product. It's just a different level. Like I always say, I think that what made me a good category manager was I could be both emotional and analytical. Like I had to understand, like, I always looked at my supervisor didn't really care about the brand story or the owner or the founder, but they cared about the velocity of the product. Was it in green or was it in red? So I had
yeah.
to balance both sides of that. But I think one of the things as a category manager, you have to really get your team on board. Because
Yeah.
I know when I first started, years ago, when I was working for a chain on the East Coast, the buyer would push out product and, and you would it would come into the store and there'd be an end cap and you would roll your eyes. I'm like, okay, this is like a $20. I remember this is a good example. We brought in this bubble bath. This is back, let me tell you, this is 20 years ago. And it was a $20 bubble bath. And ironically today, you'd be like, oh, $20 is like, yeah, it's still crazy, but it's not like crazy today, which is kind of sad. But $20 20 years ago, you'd be like, it's just bubble bath. Like, there's not much you can do with bubble bath. It is. So it'd be, so it's one of those things because the category manager wasn't very connected to the in-store teams who ultimately want the products to be successful, and I was successful because I always say I wanted them to be successful and they wanted me to be successful. And so it was a partnership, not just a top down, like, an edict that I'm just going to tell everyone this is what you have to do. So I think that when it was just different management styles. Definitely, as with grocery, it's more promotional heavy. than it is maybe compared to, natural living, but it's still important these days. I mean, it's how do you get in front of a customer? I mean, there's definitely we have more visual noise than we've ever had. Like you always say, we have more information at our hands, but we're also overstimulated, and buying decisions are more difficult. And so I was of the frame of mind as a category manager that I really felt like, like if you look at a Trader Joe's, what they did well is they helped the customer make some more buying decisions and reduce the fatigue or the decision fatigue. And also realistically, what you were doing is the customer's remorse of, I get it home, why'd I do this? Now I'm like, okay. And so that's kind of like, I guess I was looking at it different perspectives in each category.
Sure.
So I guess that's a little bit, I guess, on the two categories.
Yeah. I mean, that totally makes sense. The idea of the store support is really, it's hard to describe. And I'm sure you've had these experiences, but for myself too, like I've seen it where you think the item is going to be perfect fit. It's got the right pricing, the right promotion, the right plan behind it and support. And then it gets on the shelf. And for some reason, like it's got voids like a month later or 2 months later. And you're like, why are there voids on here? And like something happened, like the stores pulled the tag because of something. And then it's like, hey, we need to put this back out. And, to your point, that is maybe a little bit on me, not giving a little bit more information, but it's a little bit different. When you're in dairy, it's a different scale of how much you can give, but those are my cues, like, oh, something's going on. Like this is going to be a hit if we can make it land right and get the stores behind it. So then you kind of have to shift and if you can get store staff behind a product where they can be that advocate for them in a customer conversation, that's where you win. So any brands out there that can get in close with the buyer and ask for permission if it's a chain, like how do I go into the stores and work with them to help like promote, not necessarily like step on the toes or anything, but how do I support them? Can I bring some free products? Start real conversations with the staff members, and that will stick out and they'll remember that. And then that conversation will be the first thing that they think of when they're recommending products.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Robert, the one thing that I would do is I tried to help the teams understand why I was bringing in the product, because, with grocery compared to natural living, like with grocery, you're getting a lot of free fills, and through that free fills, you can make a little bit more, like if you have errors, it kind of makes up for itself, I guess, because it's like, yes, there's a lot of intuitive or experience that's going to make you make a product decision. And so with grocery, with health and beauty or supplements, you don't have that buffer of a free fill. You definitely get a discount, but you're not getting a buffer. So there has to be a little bit more of nuance to your decision. But helping the teams understand why I brought in a product and make them part of that decision really helped, because it was less about me pushing something out and helping them understand, like, okay, whether it's we're introducing a new category, or this is a new attribute that we don't currently have, or this is customer demand. By having them understand that, they were more behind my decisions and more supportive of my decisions. So it was just, I always feel like that's where you have to reduce, because 9 out of 10, I mean, obviously there's gonna be times where you're not successful and you're gonna make the wrong decision. I mean, if we were 100%, we'd all be millionaires, I say. I mean, that's realistically. But in the end of the day, I always looked at it, I was more correct than I was wrong. And so that's the good news. And a lot of that came, like I said, through experience, or really working with making sure that I was working with the right brands and the right brand partners, because it truly is a partnership, and a lot of that, like the great thing when I was doing grocery, because I was doing non-alc when I was at Bristol, and, that was a new category, but it skyrocketed because I knew it was obviously a growing category, but also there was a lot of customer demand. But I really how that grew so quickly is that brands were willing to support whether through demos, through marketing, through in-store, like they would go into the stores and like make sure that the teams were behind the product. There's several drinks brands that I can think of right now that they were actively, like, on a regular basis going in, making sure the teams tasted, because especially with grocery or drinks, like a customer comes in and they say, what I always told my team is, like, especially with supplements, like I use this with protein powders. Back in the day, protein powders didn't taste great, or certain supplements didn't taste great, but they really were effective. So I wanted my team to really be authentic with the customer. Like if it tasted bad, tell them it tasted bad, but these are going to be your benefits. And, and especially with drinks, like, drinks, okay, especially with nootropic drinks or things like that. Yeah, some of them didn't always taste great, but maybe had the energy source that they were looking for, the nootropics. So I wanted to have that. You have to be able to experience the product within grocery. So part of my process when I was bringing in product was, okay, if you're going to bring in product, I want to make sure every team member tastes your product. Because there are going to be, not every customer is going to ask you about that product, but I want them to be ready to be able to answer the question, how's this taste?
And that's a point of like actual experience, not just,
and they're going to be your biggest brand advocates in store. But, one of the things that I was always really straightforward with my brands is ultimately as a category manager, I'm making the decisions, and I didn't want you to necessarily, once you're in the store, don't go in a back end way to try to get them to either bring in a new SKU or whatever. I wanted them to be the part of the conversation, but there was always a flow of information. It was coming from me to them to, and that's the way I wanted to flow, because even though, I'm a pretty flexible individual, I wanted some structure. Because to your point, like if you don't have structure, then the dam falls. If you don't, if you're not all building at the same time, if there's one hole or one gap in that dam, it only takes one for it to fall. And so I think that as long as I was really, I wouldn't say over communicating, but clearly communicating was how I would actually perceive my role. And it would be clearly, clearly communicating to the brand, clearly communicating to in-store teams. And then we were working together for success.
Yeah, so. I couldn't agree more. Like I said, there's some challenges with the amount of volume that comes through when you look at like 50 new items coming in for a category review in grocery. That was an area that I struggled with, and you had to be selective on like, okay, these are the ones that you think you need a little bit more info, and it was just different. But in the store itself, we were always taught like, hey, new products are here. Like the grocery manager would drive that, and they would like open up product, get the team to try it, and like, hey, let's try this product, and it just came in. And I think we did a really good job in the store at that, like driving the trial to get people to really understand it. It just didn't get to that vendor level with their communication and things like that. It's just very challenging, honestly, to be doing that in grocery.
I don't agree. It's a little bit more nuanced because they're just trying to get the shelf stocked. And they don't have the time to stop what they're doing to learn about a product. They're just, okay, I got to fill a hole or stock the shelves and get the stuff out of the back stock room as quick as possible before the receiver like goes nuts. And so, so I get it. There is a little bit more challenges within grocery. So, but it's, how do you pivot? And you find like, one of the things that I always tried to make sure is I always say work with the team person in the room who's the most challenged, and fulfill those and to resolve those challenges, and then everything works forward or upward. And so retail's a lot different than it was when I first started, where it was kind of top down. Now I had to kind of structure it to make sure that the person who was the most challenging or had the most challenges, as you say, was the one who understood why we were doing it, so that I got them on board, so then everything flowed upstream.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So I wanted to just kind of piggybacking off of the meeting differences. Jennifer brought up a good question here about the length of time for meetings, and doesn't matter what department you're running, you're always short on time that you want to be able to or can be able to afford a vendor. And at the same time, vendors always want the most face time that they can get. Whatever face time you can get, it feels like it's adding value. Do you think there's a point at which there's a break in saying like, is there too much face time for a meeting, like a specific meeting type that it just doesn't add value anymore, and it just makes it kind of feel like a waste of time versus, getting truly what you want out of that meeting? Like, I have my thoughts on it, but I want you to kind of go first on that.
I would say for me, like the sweet spot probably was 30 minutes. I would have longer meetings during, like when we were doing either reviews or especially promo reviews. So we did promo reviews once a year. So it's typically in September, we're getting prepped for the following year. But then I would have, depending on like if you're a broker, I'd have quarterly meetings, because a broker is going to have, 10 brands. If you were a single brand, it might be 4 to 5 months, and we definitely would discuss that. It would depend on the number of SKUs, your velocity, like where your movement is. If it's something that like a brand has like 6 SKUs, I probably wouldn't meet them as often because it didn't make a lot of sense because they weren't adding a lot of new SKUs. But like I'd have brands that, like they were doing new SKUs every quarter. So obviously I had to meet with them every quarter, and that affected promos. But my promo planning was done. 90% of all of my promo planning was done in September for the following year. Right. And then realistically, each month, whether it was a category review or a new item, that's when I was trying to kind of sprinkling in other promotions. But I found it 30 minutes because, the way I looked at it, you're not going to probably have more than 30 minutes on the floor to talk to team members anyway. So if you can't convince me within 30 minutes, an hour is probably not, and some of that was I would prepare some of the brands beforehand, telling them what my requirements were. So that kind of, stop some of that. And, the way I kind of looked at it is maybe I was just, very, I guess, black or white when it came to this is like, it's like, I always said, I didn't need you to walk in and tell me that you were the best brand because I'd heard that 10 times today. Sure. I need to know, I wanted you, the best. And one of my favorite books I've ever read is called Gap Selling. And the way I approach my meetings or in life or it's in a personal one-to-one relationship is understanding the need of the person in front of you and that your product, your service is going to fulfill that need and the problem. And you should be able to do that within a 30-minute period. And I don't, it's one of those things like, if you came with like 50 slides, I'd probably be like, okay, let's get to what you're going to get to me. Because I had brands that I get it. They were required to have like a 30, and I'm like, okay, I understand organic. I don't need to see your farm. I do to a point, but I don't want 30 slides on your farm. I want to be like, how are you going to sell that product? Because going to where I talked about earlier, the challenge is I had supervisors or, I guess higher ups or whatever that only are looking to make sure that you're getting velocity, you're moving, getting the green, you're out of the red, those type of things. So they're not at probably that emotional level. And it's okay. Not everyone needs to be at the emotional level. I mean, both can be parallel. You can be successful. You can support brands, but if your doors are not open, you're helping no one. And so that was my philosophy is both can be coexist. You can be financially successful, but you can also be emotionally and mission driven. Yeah. And so, so I really think that a 30-minute, where you're talking, like, especially if it's a new brand, like you're saying, okay, this is the brand story. This is the founder story. That's probably 5 minutes. Then you're going into, these are the SKUs. And, if you had 15, I want to know what your ranking is. So these are the 5 that I would say, but really understanding within that call, or that meeting, I wanted them to understand where they were positioned in our store, what needs they were fulfilling, and how they were going to achieve velocity. And most people could do that within their 30-minute period if I gave them the guidance beforehand. And, I had to be a gatekeeper. There were times, like you said, I mean, my office, I always joked because it looked like it was like a mini store. Because I think, and part of that was I was so active within the CPG community. So I'd go to events and people wanted to send me stuff. They'd connect with DMs on LinkedIn. So because I was such a category manager that was so active, I probably got more than the average. Because people were like, even outside my category, were sending me items. And I wanted to be grateful and gracious of people's time. So I'm like, oh, sure, I'll give it to the right person if I can. That wasn't always the case for sure. But there were times where like I'm getting, one of our requirements is we were getting full-size bottles of everything. So as you can imagine, that's why my office looked like, a store. And I'd have to I always said I had to do like a monthly purge to be able to get into my office because it was just so constant. But I think having those now almost 29 years, I was able to look at something pretty quickly and tell you if it was like, I always looked at it like a good, better, best. The good was this is a home run. Your customer's looking for it. There's consumer demand. It's trending. Those were like the home runs. I could look at something and say, okay, those are the easy wins. And then I had my great products. It would be like, I have to do a little more research on it. And then there were the dogs. And those dogs were like the packaging's bad, the price point's bad. There was enough brand story. There was going to be no velocity. And those are the ones that were easy for me. It was always the gray areas that were going to require a little bit more partnership with the brands.
Yep. Yeah. The amount of samples I can only imagine. And to your point, like full size, it's like you have vitamins, you have supplements, body care, all sorts of stuff. And then, like you said, outside of your category, it's a lot.
Yeah.
So we have a question here. I'll throw it up on the screen. So if you're already familiar with the brand, what do you actually want to see covered in a line review or a pitch deck? And do you prefer shorter, more concise decks focused on key metrics and opportunities, or more comprehensive presentations? And then it goes on to say what information is most valuable to you versus what feels unnecessary and repetitive.
I would definitely. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, you're good. Go for it.
I mean, I definitely want to know what the attributes and the selling points for sure. But if I already was familiar with the brand, or it was an existing brand within our stores, I want to know what the rankings, what voids we had. So, and that was whether which if there was a certain one of the stores was a void, or say I was carrying if there were 5 top sellers within nationally, and we only carried the other 3, I wanted to know the other 2. So I want to know a ranking list, and I want to know voids. I want to know the promotions, what the promotions were for the year. And I would say that's the pitch deck. I didn't want to have like I said, 5 or 10 brand story type of slides, because again, I think it really depends on what type of store. So if you're going to a mom and pop, and the person making the buying decision or the category manager is also the one going to hand sell the product, then you want to get the more emotional tie, because it's one of those things like when I was working at a smaller store, and I was the one who was making the decision, but then I was also going to turn around and sell it. Yeah. I could be more emotionally tied to it because I want to make sure what my decision, I was being successful at that. But when you get to a chain level, I'm not going to, I always said I made the decision, but never touched the product again. So my in-store teams were definitely more knowledgeable on the product than I was after the initial review, because I never talked about that product again, if that makes sense. Like I'm not hand selling it constantly. I'm not going to continually have the repetitive conversation with the customer. So it was just a different format. But I always felt like, depending on what type of category, you should be able to do that with 5 to 10. You're going to talk about regional velocity, regional, what the ranking regionally is, because you want to know what the competitive analysis. So I want to know like, okay, retailer A, B, and C is carrying this product that's doing well. So I want to know the velocity level for that as well for our competitive analysis. I want to know what the voids were. I want to know what the promotions. So I'd say those are the most important things to me. And I also want to know whether it was direct or distributed. That was oftentimes what they weren't providing me. Obviously, one of the challenges is, as with retailers, is direct creates more time. Yep. And one of the things I told brands, and I would tell brands as they're introducing to retailers, you have to understand every time you introduce your brand to a category manager, all they see is more work for themselves. And, you have emotion behind it, but they were looking at like, oh, you're just creating more work for me. And so I wanted you as a brand or as a rep to show me how you were going to reduce my time and make it, help me. If I saw a brand in front of me that was going to look like I was going to have to do a lot of work, whether it was entering information, kind of guiding you a lot, I'd probably avoid it a little bit, because I'm like, I don't have that bandwidth to walk you through the whole process. So I want people to be ready with having a spreadsheet with an Excel spreadsheet with their UPCs, their descriptions, something I could quickly do and, not have so much hand holding, because again, I just didn't have that bandwidth to be able to do that constantly. And so be ready to, as a brand, to be ready, think about all the questions that the brand's going to ask you, and that's what your pick deck should represent. And one of the things I've been doing recently is I've been helping people with their pitch decks. And a lot of these brands, they don't know where they're positioned. They're like, oh, well, especially a drink brand, like it could fall into teas, it could fall into non-alc, it could fall in energy. And as a brand, you want to be really concise. You want to be like, this is where you're going to see the best velocity. This is the correct buyer. Like you're not trying to, it's that old adage of throw spaghetti at the wall and it's what's going to land type of situation. The more that you're eliminating the questions for the buyer, the more likely they're going to onboard you. The more challenges or questions you're having the category manager, the less likely they're going to onboard you, because you're creating more work for them. And go.
No, I mean, you hit a lot of really good points there, and a couple of things stood out to me. One is like the whole premise of what I do is focused on how do you make it easier for the buyer to do their job. So I love that you called that out. Unprompted.
Yeah.
It really falls back onto, and bringing it back to the question, like, what should I bring? What should I not into that presentation? I would say I agree, kind of like 5 to 10 pages. 10 is even kind of pushing it.
Yeah, I agree.
I think I think some of the repetitive things, like if you're a familiar brand, I don't need the marketing, like social media stuff. Like that's kind of noise to me. It doesn't really like, to me, you doing that is table stakes. So unless it like really directly relates to the retailer, like, hey, we want to do this and partner with you on this. If it's just general social media content and like how you're pushing the brand, I don't necessarily need to see that. And if anything, maybe just a blurb about it, maybe a small section of a slide, but not a whole slide.
I would agree. I mean, the two things I would always hear is I'm the best, which again, I would expect that if you're walking into the room to sell to me.
You have to be
I
confident.
wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think the other thing is that I would say agree with the social media. Like everyone says, oh, I have a big social media presence. And remember, I've had 10 meetings today. They're all saying that same thing. So that doesn't really define you or make you distinctive to me, because everyone can say that now. Like everyone can say they have, a social media presence. That doesn't always equate to boots on the ground or customers coming into your store. I mean, there are cases that occurs, probably like the non-alc, some bars, I would say, like if you look at some of the nutrition bars that has occurred where it's trending, or you look at some of the drinks like Prime and so forth, that definitely got people in the doors. But that's a rarity, honestly. Most buying decisions are made at the shelf level, and that's why, having that promotions, having the signage, having those, I know I do that. Like I'm not someone who would go in with, that's why you don't see sales flyers anymore, because they realize that most people are very like emotionally, like, you go into a store, you go for one thing, you leave with 10. And that's a very intentional act, obviously, because, that's how we shop, is that, I don't think that rarely do we go in for one item. So I think that's, so that's my perspective on, I guess, category management for sure.
Yeah. And one last thing here, and hopefully can help bring some perspective to this part of the question. But if you were looking at 30 minutes for one brand, that is extremely long to me. And the perspective is, when we did category reviews, we would allow a broker to come in and say, they had 3 brands to present. We would allow them about 5 minutes per brand. So think about that timeline and that difference between 5 minutes and what you can accomplish in that time. Like you have to be very concise, understand what information you need to get in front of them that is, like what Darren said, helping them solve or close the gap. And then consider 30 minutes, an extra 25 minutes. That, what are you talking about? Like, what are you really filling that meeting with in that time, just to say that you have a 30-minute meeting? And if it goes longer than that, if you're pushing 45 minutes or an hour, I would really question first of all, I probably wouldn't accept it. And if I would look at it, I would instantly come back and be like, no, I can do a half an hour. Or I would ask, like, what in the name, like, or what are you sharing with me that takes an hour? And I don't want to have a 50-page deck, that we're looking at and going through and talking through for an hour. I think the only time that I spent an hour with a brand was either at a meal, like a business meeting meal, or when it was a large brand owning the category and they were helping me with an actual category review, looking at planograms and the data and helping me analyze it. So they were more of like the captain of the category. And those were the only times that I would ever really have that much time with a single brand.
I would agree with brokers. I definitely limited, if they had, 5 to 10 brands, I mean, they definitely had to be more concise on their brands. But my expectation with the broker was a little different too, is that, I've worked for 2 types of retailers. A gourmet customer and a natural customer are not the same customer. And, a natural customer is a full shop customer, meaning they're buying 90% of their items from that store. A gourmet customer is not the same. They lean in on natural, but the majority of their basket's not all natural. And so one of the requests I had from brands is understanding, and I would tell this to brands, is understanding is this product right for this type of retailer? Because again, going back to, we worked within the same family of stores, and your store was completely different than the store I was working for. We were, we had people who were buying Tide detergent who then may lean in on a natural potato chip.
Yeah.
And so, they probably weren't looking for, our customer wasn't necessarily looking for, you know, uh, environmentally friendly packaging, because they couldn't see the value of spending $3 more on a, a recyclable plastic, but they
Right.
could see on an ingredient, or they didn't know ingredients as well. So like, I look at natural living, like I couldn't, when I first came into the retail I was working for, I had to DC a lot of items that were traditionally found, like I guess the lower velocity items that a traditional natural food store had to have, because you would say you had it because you had to
Yeah.
have it.
Because it
But our
was
customer was that night,
sick.
not that customer. So, understanding what retailer you're presenting to, I think everyone's just so desperate to get doors and say, I'm in 1,000 doors. And, some of these, like I've been doing, like I said, I was doing consulting for people. And one of the first things I asked them, they would be so excited to tell me I'm in 200 doors. And I said, what's your reorder rate? They're like, oh, I don't know. I'm like,
Yeah.
well, actually the reorder rate
That's
to me was
risky.
more important. Yeah, the reorder rate was more important. So I remember working recently with someone who was doing an electrolyte drink, and they were in pharmacies, they were in natural food, they were in some gourmet. And so when they did analysis, they realized pharmacies didn't have the velocity, but they kept presenting to pharmacies. I'm like, well, pharmacies probably are not your avenue to success. But,
Yeah.
I think as a sales manager, you're looking at it like, I just want to say I'm in 200 stores so that I can post on LinkedIn, I'm in a new store, or on social media. And that's not I understand why people do that, because we all, it's kind of some validation. But I'd rather see slow growth and intentional growth than fast growth, because I think when you look at a lot of brands, they have this like, they have this fast growth in a year, they're in like 1,000 stores, but they really were they were giving away the world to get into those stores, and they were not the correct stores to get in. And then 2 years later, they realized they're not successful because they gave away the world.
Sure.
And so that's kind of like, again, I would say to brands and brokers, making sure that you're presenting the correct products to the correct stores. And like, even if you like going back to, if you're a broker and your product line had 20 SKUs, you may realize that all 20 SKUs don't need to be in
Aren't
the
the right
store.
fit.
Yeah, just tell me, like I would say, I always want people to
Be
tell me their top
realistic.
5. Yeah, tell me your top 5, because those top 5 are probably representing 80% of your sales. The other 15 were probably 20%, unless you're like Whole Foods or someone, that larger one like that. That bottom 15 are never going to create sales within our store. So like, I'd rather have 2 facings of something and a better presence than having all 15 or 20 SKUs.
Well, that that brings up a whole other can of worms of of like the product assortment, and for that brand, if they were to have 20 SKUs, and knowing, like we all know that saying, 80% of your volume or 80% of your effort, whatever, comes from 20%. And so the number might be not exact, but the general theory is correct, that you're pushing mostly through a small percentage of whatever the product mix is. And so then you have this tail that, what purpose is it actually serving? And, just, yeah, it's just, I don't think we have time for that, because we're already at like 40, almost 45 minutes here
Okay.
of being live. So I let this one go. It was a good conversation. And I think we're going to jump off. We're going to call it, but man, Darren, thanks for jumping on. We definitely have a lot that we can talk about, so we'll have to do more of these, I think.
Yes, I love these, and I love being on here and supporting you, Robert, and what you're doing. And I think it's important to provide guidance to people, because we're all just trying to figure it out and win. And we don't know what we don't know, and so that's kind of where I think it's important to look for people who maybe have experience to be your guide. And so I think that's the value of what you're doing, and what other people are trying to do within our industry, is that we're all just trying to figure it out. But I think in the end of the day, we're all creating this amazing community that I love being part of, and I know you love being part of. And I would not give it up for anything. It was not my path, and I don't know if it was your path, but I know I thought I was going to be an artist living in New York City. So here I am, and
oh, look at that.
yeah, who knew I was going to be selling groceries? But that's the adventure that we all are seeking. I mean, our path is not linear always, but our path is, if you see what's the path in front of you and understand what's in front of you, and see the joy in the joy in the world, and enjoy in the kindness in the world, then you're going to be successful.
Absolutely. Man, appreciate it. Thanks for jumping on.